So, society is a word that gets tossed around a lot. You can have the American Philosophical Society, high society, all kinds of things. But in this talk, what I'm focusing on is the group, other than our immediate families, for which we feel a great allegiance, we often fight for, and sometimes we're even willing to die for those societies. Societies last through the generations, and membership in them is involuntary. If you're born into a society, the expectation is your grandchildren will be part of that society. You can transfer between societies, but it's an arduous process. So there are other aspects of societies. For example, societies tend to have territories. Psychologists look at issues like society members are seen to have an essence. There's an inner Frenchness to French people, Germanness to Germans, and so forth, which are also important. But when you look at societies that way, you can start to see that there are a variety of things out there, groups out there that conform to this idea. And we've been fortunate to visit a fair number of them over time. They include tribes and hunter-gatherers. This would surprise some sociologists. Some sociologists think of societies as imagined communities brought together by the modern media. But my contention and the argument of the recent book is that societies have been focal points of human life throughout history. Also, of course, prehistory and extending right into the animal world. There are animals with societies too. Here, there's a meerkat clan and a honeybee hive are also what one can call societies. This has been my opportunity to connect with people between fields. So I have, as Linda mentioned, worked a lot with psychologists and anthropologists, and I've had the opportunity to lecture for those people, even as a biologist, and give the same lecture, a more extended version with more details filled out than I can do for you here. But my mentor was E.O. Wilson, Ed Wilson, and he came up with this idea of consilience, and so this is my little contribution to that. And to me, consilience is bringing together different disciplines around important issues, and certainly societies are an important issue. Now, how do other academics perceive societies? Often, when you look at definitions in anthropology and biology, and sometimes in other fields, they center on the idea of a cooperative group. Sometimes there's a little bit about being an extended family, a fatherland or motherland, but cooperation seems to be a central premise for these definitions. And I find this curious when you look around the world today. Cooperation isn't certainly universal in societies. Your worst enemy might be an American. You can go to places like Venezuela, where we work quite a bit, and it seems to be totally dysfunctional there. But it turns out if you survey Venezuelans or talk to them, that Venezuelans are among the most patriotic people on earth. So at the other extreme, you can clearly be cooperative between societies, and of course, traveling around the world, we've become friends with many people, such as this woman we met in Tanzania and so forth, and they can become best friends. So I would say that, in short, you have to separate the idea of being social from a society. These are two different things. And sometimes, oddly enough, they get confounded. Now, there are many different types of groups within societies and between societies today. Anything from football affiliations to jobs to political parties and so forth. So societies are simply one aspect of belonging, and many of these kinds of groups are actually central to modern psychology. But I'm focusing on societies themselves. These other groups are less primal, urgent and lasting than societies. You don't think of members of your book club over there as having an inner essence of that book club, for example. So this is something that arose, these kinds of groupings is something that arose after people settled down. If you look at the anthropology of early nomadic hunter-gatherers, they did not have anything equivalent to book clubs and so forth. It's really amazing how this transformation occurred. This is part of the story of my book. And so Marilyn Brewer is someone that I speak a lot about in the book, write a lot about in the book, in terms of how this could have happened. So there's also a great focus in the literature about networks, and we've just heard Danielle talk about networks, and networks are important. We can learn a lot from them. The mathematics of networks, the amount of data we have is getting us a lot of information. But as I say here, these networks occur between societies and within societies, as I've just described, and these networks tend to be shifting. Who our friends are changes year after year, so they're more fluid. And so you would, if you're cutting through the boundaries of two societies, that might be a territory, you'll find people going across that society. You also see, hermits that don't cooperate with anybody and yet still have our passport. So my opinion became that when we need to take the emphasis off cooperation and put it on group. What is a group? And this got me into the territory of social identity, closer to the way psychologists think about these things than usually biologists do, a group with a clear membership, in-group versus out-group thinking. So when you start thinking about that, you realize that have you ever been in one of these? This is the most amazing thing in the universe. This is awesome. You can go in there and no one will want to kill you, or you won't want to kill them. You don't have to walk up and introduce yourself to anyone. You can simply get this thing called a coffee, and I hope you've had one. This is not possible. I found out this is a gap in the way people were thinking about these things, is that this is not possible for most other vertebrates. A chimpanzee would go insane in a Starbucks of other chimpanzees. Chimpanzees do not allow for the option of strangers in the room. They have to literally know everybody in their society. Humans have this capacity to be around strangers that is not seen in most other vertebrates. And we can trace this back into prehistory, and I think it reflects the dawn of the possibility of us having societies of millions, well before we did. So let's look at what this means. Basically, I decided that there are two ways of forming a society as I've looked across the animal kingdom. There are what I call individual recognition societies and anonymous societies. Individual recognition societies, everybody has to know everybody in the group. And these include a lot of different vertebrate species. And this restricts their memberships to less than 200. All these societies are quite small, presumably because of the cognitive burden of keeping track of everybody. So things like this bat cave, this is not a society. These are also not societies. These herds of buffalo, or in this case, in Africa, there's a fish swarming in the ocean and so forth, birds, all these things usually are not societies. There are a few cases they do have memberships, but for the most part, individuals can come and go from these groups. There's no sense of membership. Now, anonymous societies take another approach. They allow individuals to be distinguished as members based on some kind of trait. And as long as you have that trait, you're golden. The premier examples among the animals are the social insects. And they use simple signals, chemical cues, which are basically their national flag. And once you have that national flag, you can keep adding individuals, and it really doesn't matter as long as they have the correct flag and they stick to that flag. The ultimate example of this among the ants, The extreme example is the Argentine ant that Linda mentioned. This is an ant with societies of billions. In fact, if you live in Southern California, this ant has a colony that extends 500 miles from San Francisco to the Mexican border. You can take one of these ants, drive it 500 miles down to the Mexican border, and it's still fine because it's still home. Everybody has the emblem there. They just go straight to work. But if you carry it an inch over a borderline near San Diego, it's dead within the minute. This is David Holloway studying it in Escondido County. Nice-looking neighborhood, but the biggest battlefronts ever recorded are here. Luckily, ants don't scream as they die because there are millions of ants dying underfoot in the grass here along border fronts that go for miles and miles. It turns out Southern California has 4 colonies of these ants, and this is part of the dead at the battlefront. You do not see this sort of thing in vertebrates. You do not see it. There are a couple species that come close. You can ask me about that later, but the only species really that does seem to be equivalent is Homo sapiens. We can keep adding more and more individuals, and we allow for strangers in abundance. Now, people find this a bit disturbing. They say, Mark, you're too obsessed with ants. And I say, do not be afraid of your inner ant. This is a drawing by Peter Cooper, a New Yorker cartoonist who likes insects, so this is his version of my inner ant. Do not be afraid of that. Certainly we do things that are more complicated than ants. Smell is not quite as important for us in distinguishing groups. Arguably, maybe there's a little thing going on there, but we don't really know. What are important are many of the things that have been studied in great detail. Clearly, big signals like national flags matter, and rituals. Here's some Bushmen carrying out a dance in the Kalahari in the early years. But there are also all kinds of signals that are much more subtle. And for example, here's some Bushmen in the great distance. What if they're don't belong to your tribe? How do you know? It could be dangerous as they approach. It turns out, at least studies by Abigail Marsh at the University of Georgetown, she has shown that an American can usually distinguish another American from a great distance by how they walk or wave their hand. You won't be able to say how you do it. You just have this knowledge. And what I describe in the book is that we are basically walking billboards for our identities. They are all over our bodies, expressed in all kinds of ways, few of which we may even know about. And they revolve around all kinds of issues that probably evolved early in our past. One of them is our hair. The interesting thing about human hair is it doesn't have to be groomed like other primates do it. It's not just grooming it, it has to be styled. And most tribal groups have a tribal hairstyle. You can have some individual things going on to express your personal identity, but there's a way of expressing you belong to that tribe. And when that kind of hair evolved, Nina Jobansky, maybe you have an opinion on this, I think was a critical point in our past. It was a point where we had to express our identity through dealing with our hair. So I'm just going to mention a couple. Those are some of the preambles for the book and some of the issues in the book. Now I'm going to just pull out a couple of things from later chapters because there's a lot of details, and I've skipped some of the little logical steps that you can ask me about, but hopefully it did make sense to you. But one question is whether societies will ever go away. And my conclusion in the last chapter is that no, this is not possible. We can, for example, rely on other societies, and you might think that would reduce the differences to the point where they would be extinguished, but it turns out that the psychological studies show that reliance doesn't reduce, as it says here, the importance of the differences between societies. This is the Iroquois Confederacy shown here, which lasted for centuries, well before the Europeans came. One conclusion I have from the book, from looking across the animal kingdom and from the evidence for humans, is that whole societies, healthy societies, never freely merge. It does not seem to happen for animals, And it doesn't happen for humans. It takes some kind of force to bring societies together. So even though, for example, the Chinese are getting flooded with American goods, there's a question of what that means. The experts I've talked to suggest that the Chinese are becoming ever more Chinese. So discarding emerging societies does not seem to be possible. Even things like the EU, the EU does not have any of these symbols and venerable origin story. It doesn't have these sort of things that drive people's attachment the way their societies do. So the nations within the EU seem to be the focus of the citizen's sense of self-worth and values and so forth. So something like the EU is fundamentally disposable, the issue that the British is facing, even though it's a valuable economics tool. So another aspect of this is that our groups, we're not going to lose them because they give us meaning and validation, as I say here. They strike to our timeless yearnings to belong to groups, and we don't want to give them up. But even more fundamentally, we can't give them up. It's become clear from studies by David Kelly and Katie Kinsler and others that even an infant, 2 or 3 months old, already knows its group, its ethnic group and race, and these are groups that act like societies, and in a fuller talk I would tell you more about these groups relative to societies. But they know those groups from 2 to 3 months of age before they can speak, before they can be told about them, and they're all responding preferentially to individuals from that group. And even as adults, people like Mahzarin Banaji are showing that we have these implicit biases that we don't even see in each other and in ourselves. They're built into us, and we try to override them, but the biases tend to be there for virtually everybody. Another issue I will bring up from the book's later chapters, is the life and death of societies. These occur across species through some kind of breakdown in identity. This has not been well studied for most species. I refer to it as turning the familiar into the foreign. And this happens in different ways in different species, and it's certainly one of the major issues facing us is to learn more about how this transformation occurs. And psychologists have really not addressed it. The fact that societies go through a cycle inevitably across species, as far as I can tell. Most societies are permanent. They're like the bodies of their members. They live and they die over longer periods of time than individuals, of course. So Jared Diamond, for example, talks about the collapse of societies, but in fact, you don't need the sort of ecological catastrophes or wars that he talks about for societies to live and die and go through this cycle. And I can't go into the details there, but that's just a teaser for you to think about. So the big question, of course, is whether all this process requires aggression. It doesn't seem it might. Some species, like the bonobos, form new communities. It's only been seen once without aggression. They don't seem to get along well at first, but then they become friends again. The bonobos are friendly between societies, so they're an example in the animal kingdom of friendship between societies, which is relatively rare. So what I want you to think about in all this is simply, one more teaser for the book, and just to think about here, is that we have issues with immigration and groups within societies now. And these, to my mind, revolve around, or the issue is that citizenship legally defined doesn't correspond with how our brains register membership. We measure people by their way of being. They're walking, they're talking, all kinds of subtle things. And that dissonance between the rules of the government and how we perceive each other is certainly a reason for a lot of social conflict. So T.H. Marshall, the sociologist, said that citizenship is the claim to be accepted as a full member of the society. And given what we know about psychology, the real issue there, the trick is what we mean by the word full membership. What is full? Because we grade each other in ways that we often don't perceive. And just a concluding slide here, just to say that strangers were a big breakthrough in the history of humanity, and they come with all kinds of baggage that today is reflected not only in relationships between societies, but also within them, with ethnicities and races. And there's a couple of my little points from the end for you to think about. A lot more that could be covered. Glad for questions.
Susan Fisk, Princeton, New Jersey.
Oh, Susan, excellent.
So you might expect me to ask you about the contact hypothesis and groups learning to get along with each other when they're interdependent, and shifts in identity to thinking of ourselves as a nation of immigrants. I think there's evidence that identity can change over time and with circumstances and interdependence. I'd be interested in your comments on that.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to those. These are all meaty ideas. I have a whole section within the book about how identity shifts. People tend to think of their identities as stable, but they're not. And so this false belief in the stability of our identities is often an issue as well. But identities shift constantly in terms of integrating other groups, and how that happens. Gosh, it's like a long discussion, but we are constantly navigating our identities relative to other groups and shifting them in response. And I'm not sure which examples to bring up, but I mean, I agree with what you're saying. I could go farther, but I think it would take too many words, but we can talk afterwards. But ask me more specific questions along those lines too, if you want.
Thanks, Mark. This is Nina Jablonski, State College, Pennsylvania. You brought up the interesting point about the origin of implicit bias. And you showed the slide of lots of different people in this little baby, and you alluded, or you seemed to indicate that implicit bias was something that was inborn and not based on experience. Could you elaborate further on your ideas of the origin of implicit bias?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I mean, I think there is a sense in which these groups form in babies' heads, as I say, before they're taught them. How they learn those groups, and particularly how they respond to those groups, is an interesting question of development, whether they need to see those groups as fundamentally different or inferior is a major question. But implicit bias has not been, it's usually studied in adults. It's just the version of what children show in terms of these biases that is interesting at the moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Over here. Hi, Ellen Winner, Cambridge. I just wondered what causes a society to be an individually recognized versus an anonymous society. And it seemed from what you were saying that it was simply size. And so first question is it size? And second question is, when humans first began and lived in tiny groups, were we an individually recognized society?
Good question, and elements that I had to remove from the talk. Anonymous societies where we use some sort of signal to indicate membership, can exist at even small sizes. So, for example, an ant colony of 4, in some species, ants have very small societies, they still have that national emblem going on. Even a small society can make use of that for efficiency purposes. It's like wearing the t-shirt of your baseball team. You don't need the t-shirt because you know everybody, but if you have an orange t-shirt on, you're going to respond much quicker to figure out who belongs and who doesn't if there's a dangerous situation, for example. So early humans probably had these anonymous societies, certainly our species going back to its origins, I believe. And I have a hypothesis about how this could have arisen, these sort of signals based on the panthoot of the chimpanzee, and it's like a 5-minute answer, but the chimpanzees have a pant-hoot. They don't have any of these signals at all. If there are cultural differences between their societies, so one community might use a stick to eat termites, and the next one doesn't have that tradition, but you never see a chimpanzee attacking another chimpanzee who doesn't know how to use the tool when it's supposed to. So they don't use any of these cultural differences in the way I'm talking about. But they do have something called the pant-hoot, which is if Jane Goodall had just been here, she would be doing it on stage. That's what she does every time. It's a loud call that they use basically to talk to each other over a great distance. And they determine, the thought is, who belongs. Our society is over there, members of their society is over here. They have to keep track of all these individuals moving around. But they don't use it, the thought is, for walking up to each other and saying, I belong here. They don't use it as a signal of identity, individual identity in that way. But there is one clue that they might get close to that. And there's a guy named Andrew Marshall at the University of Michigan who was studying some captive chimpanzees, and they all had the same pant-hoot. The tradition is that each society of chimpanzees develops their own pant-hoot so they can tell each other apart. So they all had their own pant-hoot, but one of them had trouble pronouncing it, and they didn't let him eat with them, and they eventually drove him into the moat and drowned him.
What?
Whether that was the reason or not, I'm not sure. But
Okay.
so that pant-hoot, you can imagine something like that in the human past being a very simple start. But of course, having a single thing like a pant-hoot could be easily, you could trick people into thinking you belong. So you started adding more and more of these characteristics to make it foolproof.
Karine Shemla, Paris. I would like to go back to the experiment with babies.
Bees.
Babies.
Oh, babies.
Because it seems to me that when you do the experiment, you have, as the person who is doing the experiment, to have a concept of what the group is to give the baby to see. So would different people doing the experiment start with different concepts of group? Would that change the experiment, the results of the experiment? Because it seems to me that there is an inbuilt concept of group in the experiment that might come up in the conclusion, but was it not put in the premises of the experiment?
Yes, well, there well could be. And one reason I'm writing this is to bridge things that still are not fully resolved. So I'd like to see a lot more on this. It's just been a couple of people working on it, but both in terms of young children and adults, there's a good deal of evidence showing that we parse things into groups, whether we like to or not, whether they even exist or not. So if a person, if we're talking of race, is intermediate between black and white in their skin tone, we zero in on how their hair looks, their nose, and other things, and we allow very little to go on between. Things are either in one group or another. So this kind of manufacturing of groups seems to be well entrenched in our species, even when they, in the biological sense, don't even exist.
Kamal Bava from University of Massachusetts, Boston. Mark, a very fascinating talk.
Thanks, Kamal.
I think we are self-focused. How about swarms or societies in other groups, plants, fungi? How about groups that involve more than one species? Have you given any thought to those?
Oh, well, good questions. There are all kinds of things in all these topics, but one of my favorite for that is the leafcutter ants. They have a fungus that is part of their group's identity. Leafcutter ants eat a fungus, And to have the equivalent happen for humans, the corn plants of America would have to be something that we loved, and we hated the corn plants of Europe and elsewhere in the world. The leafcutter ants actually have the same species throughout all their colonies, but this particular strain becomes identified with the colonies, and they will eat only it and remove all other colonies. That's really kind of cool. It's like our dogs belong to our families, but they don't belong to our society. So this kind of identity floats over in a new way with these leafcutter ants. And I could talk about some of these other kinds of things that are like societies, but the most clear one is our own bodies and the bodies of all organisms, because our cells are basically a unified society. You can scrape off, and as I've been doing with this podium here, scraping off my skin cells as I move around, but those cells cannot go off and form a new mark. They're either with me or they're dead. And that's true for ants too. Ants have no options. Even if they're beaten up by their fellow ants, they don't all get along. It's not all cooperation, even in an ant colony. Even if they're killed by their other nestmates, they have no option to leave. So those are what I would call a superorganism, those kinds of societies where they actually are united in their identity. And we love our independence. Humans would not want to be a superorganism.